whereabouts in the world you're joining us from. And welcome to the first in this year's series of workshops led by the London Policing College. This year is to explore the impact of COVID on particularly the police, the relationships between police and communities. In some of the details coming out of the various workshops will lead us into not only the conference itself, but hopefully some academic papers following on from that. So this is the first of this year's workshop, and I'm delighted to see so many people joining us. And the first one today is on the subject of domestic abuse, and I'm delighted that we have Polly Harar, CEO of the Sharam Project, a great friend of LPC, but also an expert in her own field in her own right. Polly's assembled a stellar cast for this first workshop, and without any further ado, I'm going to ask Polly to take the reins, introduce the team and how the session is going to run. So thanks very much for joining us all. Please make use of the chat function. We'll try and answer your questions either online or through the afternoon, but if not, we will get back to you. And the session is being recorded just for your interest, so you can go back and check up on it. So without further ado, and for more detail, I'll now hand you over to Polly. So Polly, thank you very much for running this for us, and welcome.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Really appreciate your attendance, and also for big thank you to our speakers for giving up their time to be here today. Before I start, I just wanted to highlight some housekeeping and then just go through how the afternoon is going to be run. So with regards to housekeeping, as Bob mentioned, this event is being recorded, but equally, this is also a safe space for us to have those meaningful conversations around such an important issue. So please do use the chat. And we do recognise that domestic abuse can act as a trigger for some people. So again, if you do need access to support or services, please do let us know, and we can put you in touch with a service that could be able to assist. Now, I don't need to tell everyone here the significance of this being the first workshop in this series, and particularly addressing domestic abuse. And we're looking at what the future of safeguarding is, today is a really important start for that. So with that said, what we will be doing is going through a series of speakers who've very kindly agreed to be here today, and specialists in their areas and their fields. And then we will have them present a short paper, followed by some moderated questions from myself. And then at the end of this first session, my co-moderator, Dr. Victor Alisa, will pick up and lead on the the panel discussion. So please do throughout put your questions in the chat. We will try and get through as much as we can. Now, bearing in mind that we only have a short time to cover so much, I wanted to sort of just go through initially what the abstract is for this workshop. So the aim of this workshop is very much to explore the role of policing when tackling domestic abuse, and the need to recognise masculinity culture as a determining factor. Now, we know from recent events that domestic violence continues to be at the forefront of the press and the media, and in our own within headlines, as well as raise questions as to how the policing responses can really be effectively impacted through legislative change. So with that said, what we will do today is hear from some leading experts and professionals to better understand domestic abuse in the context of what works, what doesn't work, and most importantly, what we can all do to make an effective difference to ensure that responses to violence against women and girls is not just effective, but is proportionate. So, as I mentioned, I'm delighted to be co-moderating this workshop today with Dr. Victor Alisa. And as you'll hear from our stellar lineup of speakers, the impact of domestic abuse can have on a legislative setting, the voice of migrant women, why masculinity culture needs to be addressed, and how the domestic abuse strategy will affect policing responses, as well as an employer's duty to safeguard employees. So as you can see from that, we've got a huge amount to cover. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who will set the scene on masculinity culture and what more the police need to do in order to effectively address domestic abuse. Daisy Carrillo, welcome, and we're really delighted to have you here today, and look forward to initially seeing your paper, and then we'll go through some questions afterwards. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Polly. Let me just share my screen now. Okay. Can you please let me know, Polly, if you can see my screen?
We can see your screen. It's great. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Daisy Carrillo. I am a domestic abuse survivor. And more importantly, I am an academic now that specializes in researching about gender-based crimes and policing. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the factors and different variables that can affect police officers' attitudes and responses when dealing with domestic abuse incidents. Okay. So, in theory, police officers have the duty to and responsibility to protect all citizens, including those behind the closed doors of the family home. However, there are some factors that may impact the responses of some of them. And the lack of knowledge of the crime dynamic is one of those factors. And in this context, the academic literature maintains that coercive and controlling abuse is one of the most frequent and common and harmful forms of abuse. However, evidence suggests that some officers continue to struggle to identify accurately this type of abuse. In some cases, actions and behaviors can be seen as having a bad partner rather than abusing one. Since 2015, coercive, controlling and coercive behavior is a criminal offense, but statistically speaking, is the less recorded. For example, in 2020, only 24,856 offenses were recorded by the police, which suggests that the escalation dynamics of domestic abuse are not well being understood. Another factor to consider is the police discretion. When conducting investigations, police officers, they are in a position where they need to use their discretion and judgment to interpret and to apply the law. The literature argues that discretion is one of the most powerful and unpredictable tools the officers hold when conducting investigations, as they can condemn or disregard any action. Likewise, these discretional powers may also enable them to conduct themselves in line with occupational culture or personal views as an opposed or legal principles, values, and standards of behavior. However, regardless of discretion is not always used adequately by some officers, it is an inescapable and essential part of policing, as due to the lack of resources and staff, it is impossible to enforce the law in every single case. Consequently, it is vital that all officers base their decisions in accordance with the law, as they are in a position where their decisions and judgment can have a negative impact in an individual or in a whole group of people. Another factor that can impact the police responses is the occupational culture. When we talk about the police occupational culture, we are referring to those accepted practices, underlying attitudes and values that construct and transmit norms of how to be a police officer and how to do policing. The police culture, like any other culture, is built through interaction, presumed formalities, and narrative. There is a broad argument about the negative impact that the police quota have when investigating gender-based crimes, such as sexual assault, harassment, and domestic abuse. For example, as you all can see in the slide, there is some academic evidence that illustrate that some officers don't see domestic abuse neither as a priority or a serious crime. However, I think we are all here today to have an honest and open discussion and a conversation about how can we gain a cultural shift to prevent future tragedies. I believe that it's crucial to begin to challenge effectively misconduct and be realistic about the consequences of gender biases. Because if an officer has sexist and misogynist views, how do you think that we respond to offenses that affect disproportionately women? Likewise, I also believe that we need to start thinking about the role of bystanders and how they also are part of this culture that produce these harmful behaviors. For example, in here, perhaps we can start, thinking or reasoning about the role they play, all the bystanders around Wayne Couzens. We always have to consider now all these different perspectives and what will happen if someone says something, what will happen if someone intervenes in time. According to the bystander theory, in situations where the person misbehaving is known by the bystander, such as a friend or a co-worker, it is very unlikely that an intervention takes place. And one of the reasons is because bystanders, they may be afraid of the social consequence that speaking out represents. For example, they may be concerned as maybe being seen as like, soft or less masculine, or maybe they're not gonna be seen as one of the boys anymore. I believe that, as an academic, the bystander approaches could be an effective strategy to helping people, especially police officers, to think about ways in which they can break their complicity silence and become more active bystanders. Let me give you an example. If a male officer is in any way disrespectful or abusive toward women in general, or maybe towards a co-worker or a victim, rather than remaining silent, other officers need to begin to challenge these behaviors by reporting the misconduct or urging the officer to seek help, or just simple by showing disapproval. The idea is to break the bystander silence in any way possible. And this is the part where leadership plays a significant role, because bystanders need to be supported accurately. There must be no repercussion and consequence for breaking the silence. Now, let's talk very briefly about the masculinity culture within the police and the historical context. The police force is a masculine constructed institution. Therefore, it has a long-lasting male-dominating history. It was not until 1918 when the first women was recruited into the force. That is 192 years after the formation of the police force. Historically, the police force has been recognized as a substantially gendered setting where masculine behaviors such as bravery, strength, dominance are endorsed and valued. In our society, women represent 51% of the population in England and Wales. However, in the police force, they represent only 31.2%. Therefore, this suggests that these patriarchal structures in the police continue to be preserved. When we're talking about masculinity culture, we're referring about a widespread social constructed phenomenon that is pretty much everywhere and involves behavior, language, practices that are commonly associated with males. In our society, social roles are assigned, arranged, and socially constructed based on gender, following patriarchal system. So What can we do to change the views and the narratives? In my opinion, first, we need to start contest the way we use language, especially when we're talking about gender-based crimes. I'm not going to go through all these exercises, I'm not going to have time, but I think this exercise by Dr. Jackson Cass illustrates how unconscious cognitive structures are set up to remove men from the conversation. If we focus to what happened to women as an opposed or what men do to women, we will never get anything done about male violence against women and girls. Also, I believe that we need to stop asking why women don't leave and begin to ask a different set of questions, including why men choose to abuse women. Another thing that we can do is, and this is a very important part, engage all men in the discussions and prevention strategies, as I strongly believe they are crucial allies to end all forms of gender violence and tackle masculinity culture. They are in a position where they can, around peers, start questioning, start, disagreeing in the way some males talk about females. And also we have to remember here that the reality is the men, they hold the most economical and political power. So we need them to be our allies to get something done. Also, we need a cultural shift to promote and support the well-being of victims, not only in the police service, but also in the whole society. It is crucial also to provide police officers with essential resources, leadership, education to gain this cultural shift. I also believe that, as an academic, considering the male account for nearly 70% of the police service, there is an absence of inquiry about male officers as perpetrators. I am not saying with this that all officers are abusive toward women, but however, this is an epidemic that is all around whole society. So the chances are that there are someone in there as well that is a perpetrator. So we need more research about this. And I strongly believe that if we want to start evaluating the opinions of some males within the institution, an excellent place to start will be to evaluate the experiences of female officers within the institution. So there is a lot of research in there that we need. We need to try to get evidence-based research to see how can we do something about it. I found this quote, and it's for Desmond Tutu, and I think it's so relevant to, to violence against women and girls. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, and we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. We need to start digging and what are the causes, what is happening, why is the root of the problem, and start changing all this narrative. I strongly believe that everything that is learned can be unlearned. It is possible to change the narrative and build a new history. However, it is so important to recognize and challenge the tackle of the roots of the problem before that. So this is all for me. So thank you very much for listening, and over to you now, Polly. 1 second. Oh, okay, we go. You are mute, Polly.
Sorry, thank you so much, Daisy. That was a fantastic presentation. I was quite shocked with some of the statistics that you outlined there, but understandably, this is the issue that we're all dealing with right now. So I wanted to start with what you mentioned about the bystander effect and its complicity, and ask why you feel it is so important to look at the masculinity culture aspect when we're addressing a policing response to domestic abuse.
Masculinity culture have a wide range of negative concepts, including gender biases. And gender biases within the police, it is a serious concern because it's improper, it's discriminatory, and it's unlawful. These behaviors and attitudes not only deny victims the equal protection they deserve of the law and their protection from harm, but it also destroy the trust between the law enforcement and the communities they serve. We need to start having a serious conversation about how sexism, gender stereotype, misogynist views, and discriminatory views towards female affect policing. And when I talk about, the bystander approach, there are many different approaches for this. You can actually use it as a model for whole society or just for the people around you. And I strongly believe that if we create something where officers become aware of the damage, or what it is, how is to intervene, and what is the reason they don't decide to intervene, it will be very valuable. So I think holding accountable the action by others, highlighting the problem, and it is a very useful way to to begin to do something.
I think that's absolutely fantastic, and we're certainly not placing all men in the same brush, in the sense of we recognise that like you mentioned, men are part of that solution. With that in mind, given that, as you've highlighted, that policing is largely male dominated and that men hold the majority of political and economic power, how can they also be part of that solution?
Everyone should be part of the conversation and the possible solution, particularly men. So, this is an issue that we all have to talk about it, to actually try to find why this is happening. The male in particular, they are in a position where they can begin to act like, empowered bystanders who can confront discriminatory abusive peers. So therefore, it is crucial to have them as allies in order to end all forms of abuse and tackle masculinity culture. So, let's think about it, maybe you go a friend or you go a family member or a co-worker. When I say, become an active bystander, is no confrontation. There are many different ways that someone can move to be an active bystander. Maybe just by showing disapproval. When you show disapproval to a person, psychologically something activates in there. So that's why I strongly believe the men are in the position where they can start challenging these masculinity cultures.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Daisy. Just one more question from me. When we're looking at the future of policing in relation to domestic abuse, what steps can we all take today to ensure that history doesn't keep repeating itself? What are the lessons that can be learned?
There's so many lessons. We can talk about, the whole day about this. There is no doubt that we need a cultural shift that promotes the safety and the support and the well-being of women, not only in the police service, but also in the whole society. And as I say, it is the way we use language. For example, let me give you an example. How we talk about 1,000 women were raped, rather than 1,000 women were raped by men. So, it is just these things about how we use language, the terminology. And then we have to be realistic. We have to be realistic. We have to admit that there is an issue there. The more important part is, what can we do? What can we do? Let's evaluate, what you need to improve. And then, it is so difficult to actually get access to have research, to research into the police officers. So, but then, they can actually then do independent inquiries and all this, but it is about taking on board as well all those recommendations, because otherwise, we just kind of have inquiries and nothing gets changed. We need the leadership in there. We need those in those positions to support the ones, the bystander. Let's say if I go and report, one of my colleagues, I don't want to have consequence. So this is the part when leadership actually plays a significant role in all this.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Daisy. And I'm sure we'll have further really interesting conversations in the panel discussion a bit later. So thank you again so much. Really, really
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Brilliant. So my next speaker is Emily Hodge, who works in the Practice and Partnerships team at the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office. So Emily has kindly agreed to share details of the work of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and how they are working to ensure the future of safeguarding remains a high priority. So Emily, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Polly. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen. Fantastic.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Domestic Abuse Act and the role of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, which is a statutory office holder within the Act. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner is Nicole Jacobs, this lady here on the screen, and she has been in post for 2 years now, since September 2019. And her powers under the Act and of our office actually come in on the 1st of November this year. The reason the Act and the role of the Commissioner came about was because it was recognised that the prevalence of domestic abuse remains too high, and that there is a postcode lottery in terms of services available to people and the response from different agencies across England and Wales. So it's really important that this Act brings some streamlining to that and some stronger mechanisms to support victims affected by domestic abuse, as well as holding people to account. So the Commissioner holds a key role in holding national and local government to account and public agencies, and in terms of shining a spotlight on both good and poor practice. There's now a duty on statutory agencies and government departments to have a legal duty to respond to the Domestic Abuse Commissioner with any recommendations or requests that she makes within 56 days. So the priorities of the Commissioner are to represent and magnify the voices of victims and survivors of domestic abuse. One of the key priorities of our office at the moment is the mapping of community-based services. So under the Act, there is now a statutory duty for safe accommodation for victims and children affected by domestic abuse and support within safe accommodation, but there's still no statutory duty for community-based services. So that's IDFAs, that's advocacy, that's recovery programs, that's therapeutic programs. There's no statutory duty at all, and so the government have asked our office to map these services with a view that this can be put forward as a potential amendment to the Victims Bill coming up for a statutory duty, which would in turn hopefully bring new burdens funding with it. So that's something our office are really focusing on at the moment, and we've just closed the survey for that mapping work. We continue to monitor the impact of COVID as well, and to improve the national response to domestic abuse. So the Act came into law or received royal assent in April this year, which we were very happy about after a long time being delayed due to Brexit and the pandemic and the proroguing of Parliament. But we got there in the end. So the Domestic Abuse Commissioner is now statutory office holder. There's a new statutory definition of domestic abuse, and one of the key differences in this one is that children are recognised in their own right as victims of domestic abuse, and that's a really important shift in the legislation. There's now going to be new orders and notices that can be used. I know that these are currently being applied for in terms of the pilot, and I think other people will be talking about that later. And I've already mentioned the safe accommodation statutory duty as well. Continuing on with some points around the Act, it now prohibits perpetrators of abuse from cross-examining their victims in person in the family courts in England and Wales, which is really positive. It ensures that anybody made homeless as a result of domestic abuse has an automatic priority need for housing, which again is a shift and really important for people who are fleeing abuse. It creates a statutory presumption that victims are eligible for special measures in the criminal courts, for example, giving evidence via video link, and it places the guidance supporting the Clare's Law on a statutory footing. There's a new standalone offence of non-fatal strangulation. So we know that 29% of domestic homicides involve strangulation or include strangulation. And we also recognise that it's an incredibly traumatic experience for somebody who goes through that where it is non-fatal. And so this is now an offence in its own right. The coercive control offence now includes post-separation abuse, which is really vital to people who have separated from somebody and an ex-partner continues to abuse them post-separation. It can be stalking, harassment. It can be in relation to financial and economic abuse. So even if someone has separated many years ago, if that abuse continues, it now falls under the coercive control offence. Sharing intimate images was already a criminal offence, but under the Act, the threat to share intimate images is also a criminal offence now. And then all domestic homicides review will now be shared with the Commissioner's Office to help us build a stronger mechanism, an oversight mechanism for domestic homicide, ensuring that the learning is really captured and embedded across the country in a more centralised way. Key priorities for the Commissioner and our office for this coming year ahead. Many of these are amendments that were put forward in the Domestic Abuse Act, but unfortunately were rejected by government at the sort of the final stages. But they're things that we still continue to focus on and hope for in the future in other ways. One of the main ones being support for migrant victims and survivors of domestic abuse. We are currently just finalising a report where we've been doing a couple of pilots and commissioned out some research on this, and we will be launching a new report on this in the autumn around a migrant victims pilot and looking at the effect, the sort of services available to people with no recourse to public funds and their experiences of how they flee and get support for domestic abuse. We continue to look at improving experience of survivors and children in the family courts. We know this is a real issue in a lot of areas, and one of the amendments that was rejected was training, specialist domestic abuse training for the judiciary and staff within the family courts. So that's something we continue to push for and prioritise. I've mentioned the oversight mechanism for domestic homicide, which we're now working on. We've got somebody specifically working on that in our office. We continue to lobby for secure long-term sustainable funding, like multi-year funding for services for both accommodation-based and community-based services. Many of our providers are from the voluntary and community sector, and it's just not sustainable for them to have such short turnarounds of funding, both in terms of application times and delivery times. And then we're also working to secure implementation of the recommendation that there's an information sharing firewall between Border Force and the police as a result of the super complaint. But this is really about people fleeing domestic abuse who have insecure immigration status and are often reliant on a partner or an ex-partner. This is often used as a form of control again, and sometimes people have the choice, are made to feel they have a choice of either fleeing domestic abuse or remaining in the country, and we need to make sure that there's a firewall there to ensure that people get to safety first and that their immigration, they're not deported as a result of fleeing domestic abuse and reporting it. I'm going to stop there, and I know Polly's got some questions which I'm very happy to take, so I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. We've actually had a question come in as a direct result of your presentation, and that is, does the intimate images include women unveiled? I've heard of women trying to report this to police and it's not being taken seriously.
That's a really good question, and I don't actually know the answer to that off the top of my head, but while I'm on this call, when I've finished my part of the presentation, I will drop a message to someone in our policy team to try and get an answer on that before the end of the session, if that's okay.
That is fantastic, and thank you so much for the person who put that question forward. I do have another question for you, Emily. Yep. Looking at the long list of priorities that your office will be covering, I just wondered, what is the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office doing to instill domestic abuse and sexual violence into the serious violence prevention duty? And the second part of that is, why is it so important that this is included in the Police and Crimes Bill at the same time, at the same endemic priority as, say, for example, knife crime or terrorism? Huge question there. Apologies.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I might take the second bit first, actually, and then come on to the first bit. So domestic abuse and sexual violence are obviously very, very common, and I think alluding to what Daisy was saying in the first presentation, there's something about these things becoming so normalized now that they're not taken seriously anymore, and there's a real issue in terms of them being treated with the same severity as other crimes, like you've mentioned, in terms of terrorism and knife crime and gangs, and so the kind of the knock-on effects of that means that victims feel they're not going to be taken seriously, and therefore there's a lack of trust from victims to want to report these crimes, and so there's a real need for these things to be named in the Police and Criming Bill under the serious prevention duty, so that they're shrouded in statute, and we've especially seen high levels of these things since the pandemic as well. So we're really pushing for an amendment to be put forward in the Police and Crimes Bill that name domestic abuse and sexual violence in the serious crime prevention duty, which at the moment it's not included, and that's a real concern for the Commissioner and for our office. So that's something that we're really going to be pushing for. If it's not included in the definition, then it becomes an individual decision for individual PCCs and constabularies and police forces to make that decision themselves. So it becomes a bit like if each police force was asked to choose whether they put terrorism and prevent into an agenda that they're going to focus on. It's the same about violence against women and girls and domestic abuse. And so that's why we're pushing so much for it to be included, because part of our priority, as I mentioned, is about ending that postcode lottery to responses to domestic abuse, both in terms of the services that are provided, but also as public bodies and agencies, and how we do that in a coordinated way across England and Wales.
That's fantastic. That's really good to hear, actually, because as you mentioned, the postcode lottery approach for men, victims and survivors is a reality that is yet to be addressed. So really important that we get that included there. Just another final question for me is, how can the police improve their response to domestic abuse and reduce the number of cases that are all too often filed as no further action?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, that's something that we are looking at and focusing on at the moment. So I think the first thing to say is that we really feel very strongly that multi-agency working and working with other statutory bodies and specialist services is absolutely essential at a local level for the police to be aware of what is going on in the local areas that are in. So in London, for example, at a borough level, as well as borough command units, but at individual borough levels, each borough commissions different specialist services and has different kind of borough multi-agency responses. So it's really important that you're tapped into kind of local strategic partnerships and operational groups that are having that are working in domestic abuse, and also in terms of kind of safeguarding of children and children as victims in their own right as well. That's really important that the police are tapped into that. I think knowing how to identify high-risk individuals and behaviours, and also recognising the importance of the victim's voice, the victim's wants and needs and wishes within any sort of call out is really important. And it's very encouraging that the Met have recently rolled out the DA Matters training to so many people, and I've seen some of the evaluation of that, and I think building that empathy and understanding of the nuances of domestic abuse is absolutely important for officers on the ground. The thing around kind of NFA in cases is problematic from our perspective, and we would advise caution around this. It's really important that domestic abuse is recorded at all stages and every incident to be able to capture the volume of abuse, but also historical context of abuse as well. And when something is NFA'd, what we tend to find is that victims have regrets about not wanting to engage at the time, but might actually want to engage a little bit afterwards when they've had time to process what's happening. And if a trauma-informed approach is taken, then that's much more beneficial for the person who's experienced that. So that's something that we would really push for and recommend. So yeah, I think that's probably my answer to that question, because I could talk about this for hours, but I won't.
No, absolutely. Just picking up on your last comment there with regards to the NFAs and the incidents and having a more trauma-informed and victim-led approach, We know that quite often a woman will experience over 30 separate incidences before she accesses support. And it may be that for every one victim, there are several incidents that have been reported and they've all been filed down as no further action. Is there a move to try and identify or map the number of incidences per victim in order to establish the levels of risk? Or are we going to continue to see a no further action report per individual as opposed to per perpetrator involved in that case?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question in terms of shifting the accountability onto perpetrators away from victims and the risk of victim blaming within that. To be honest, I would put that question to the police to ask that question, because it's something that I think could be addressed in other forums and through kind of internal processes and how that's done. I know there's various different pilots going on across London and across England and Wales, and I think there needs to be a lot of thought put into NFA in cases and the risks to, obviously, to the victims first and foremost, but also to the Met in terms of NFA in cases at the scene as well. So I think there's a lot more thinking through that to do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Emily. That was fantastic. I'd love to go straight over to our next speaker now, which is Vicky. Vicky is from the Hillingdon Women's Centre, and she's a human rights activist and an expert on violence against women and girls with a specialism in harmful practices. And she also leads on the Workplace Safe Space Initiative, which is a fantastic programme. So Vicky, welcome. And please do start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Polly, and thanks everyone for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, just give me a second. Oh, I lost my presentation. Do you see it now?
Not as yet, no.
No, okay, so probably I chose the wrong one. Okay.
Yeah, you can
this
see
one?
the screen.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Right. Okay, so this is the right one. I was choosing another presentation. So basically, my presentation today is about talking about the struggles that we as a small charity have had during the pandemic and that we are still having now, and trying to find, if not an answer, a possible way to start tackling and preventing domestic abuse. I come from a very small and local charity. The name is Hillingdon Women's Centre. We have been established in the London Borough of Hillingdon for about 35 years. And over the time, we have had different services, but I guess that at the moment we are really established, and it is very clear that there is a need of specific local strategies to tackle domestic abuse. Although we provide information, advice, and guidance services for more generic issues like housing, immigration, legal advice, welfare benefits, we have seen over the time that the majority of our service users have been experiencing domestic abuse. So we are dealing with either current or historical cases of domestic abuse. Previous or before the lockdown, we could actually say that 50% of the women attending to our service were experiencing domestic abuse or had experienced domestic abuse in the past. What I can say confidently at the moment is that this number has increased from 50% to 65%. So this really is telling us that we really need to do something about it, and that this is everybody's business, that domestic abuse is not a problem that has just suddenly appeared because of the lockdown. but that in reality, it has been there all the time. But during lockdown, it has been exacerbated, and we have been able to see how it has emerged from the darkness, because it has already been there. So in order to respond to this problem, and I guess I'm taking Daisy's point about tackling it from the root cause. So we are very used to have these reactive strategies where we are trying to deal with the crisis. And I'm absolutely sure that we really need to do that. And this is what the Hillingdon Women's Centre is doing at the moment by providing emotional and practical support to survivors of domestic abuse. But that is only a reaction of a problem that needs to be tackled from the root. And this is why I am personally very drawn to work on prevention. And the only way to work on prevention, I guess, is starting to change the mindset and educating people all over the places, no matter how old you are, what is your background, you need to know about domestic abuse, and mainly about violence against women and girls. So we know as in our professional experience that for women experiencing domestic abuse, the workplace is already a safe space. This is why we chose this name for this initiative. So for many women who are working, being at the office, for example, is the only moment where they could reach some kind of peace, where they can actually breathe. So your workplace becomes some sort of a haven, a place where you can be yourself, where you feel protected, and where many women try to stay in that place because they know that coming home, they will live a different reality. But the real problem there is that their colleagues or the managers are not really aware of what's going on. And again, many people decide not to intervene because they believe this is something domestic, this is something that only happens within the families, and maybe we are not allowed to say anything because we don't want to cause any discomfort. But the reality is that changes only happen if we cause that discomfort, if we really take a step, and if we really ask the right questions in the right spaces. So for all of you, it is known that we had the lockdown and all these numbers in reporting domestic abuse cases were increased. What we were thinking is, well, the restrictions will ease or disappear in a certain point, and all these women who had been experiencing these abusive behaviors or had discovered for different ways that they had been abused, some of them may come back to work. What is going to happen there? Are we just going to let them alone? Or are we just going to give them a hand and we are going to enable them to report what's going on and seek support? So this is why we decided to work or create the Workplace Safe Space Initiative. The Workplace Safe Space Initiative provides free specialist training and consultation to local businesses in and around the London Borough of Hillingdon in order to equip employers with the skills and knowledge to prevent and tackle domestic abuse and become workplace champions. So the whole idea is that we want to make workplaces a safe space for women and also men to disclose what's going on in a space where they can actually feel understood and where they can actually get the right support. But also it's about enabling the employers to know how to react, because we can actually know that they are scared. You don't know how to face these situations. You might think that I may put this woman in danger, or maybe I just want to save her immediately. What should I do? Should I stay silent? Should I call the police? What exactly are the right steps to take? So what we wanted to do with this program is to make sure that all the organizations, agencies, and employers that participated here had the right tools to provide this right support and a referral pathway for the people who have disclosed domestic abuse. So this program was thanks to the funds from the Ministry of Justice and the London Community Foundation. So this was a program that was supposed to be developed in around 6 months, but thankfully things changed and the span was increased, and we were able to do this over a year. So this really allowed us to pilot and know exactly what to do, what to improve, and get some numbers and specific outcomes to share with the members of the public. And of course, the Hillingdon Women's Centre, we were not alone, and it would have been impossible for us to do this alone. So we really needed to have strong partnerships to make this happen. And we were very, very lucky to have the Sharon Project working with us, as well as Belina Grow, and of course the London Borough of Hillingdon, who provided a lot of support on how to develop and how to deliver this program. As I mentioned before, the goals of this program is the first and the most important thing is to send a strong and unmistakable message that all forms of domestic abuse and gender-based violence are unacceptable. So it's about speaking out. It is about challenging. It's about saying that it is not acceptable. Voice it and make it very clear. So we just don't want people to have like this half of commitment, or I'm going to say it sometimes. Is just upfront. And me as an organization, as an agency, as an employer, I have to be verbalize it and say, this is a zero tolerance place of domestic violence or violence against women and girls. So we supported initially employers from the area of Hillingdon, but we were very successful, and we were very happy to have some other employers from other areas around Hillingdon and even really far from Hillingdon. But mainly we wanted to start by developing this sense of what is domestic violence, why is this such an important issue that needs to be tackled and prevented, and me as an employer, what I can do. And it is very important for us that we start by taking action and creating effective domestic abuse policies. Because the reality is that we just cannot expect domestic abuse survivors to disclose and say, you know, this is what's happening to me and I need support. And that the responsibility of the employer ends in just telling them, call the police. I guess that once that domestic abuse survivor takes this or decides to go to the police and take action, there is going to be a long way for her or him to be totally free and have a new life. So these domestic abuse policies need to take into account that the workplace needs to enable this freedom by providing specific actions depending on these survivor needs. So having that in a document is really, really important, because we need that all the people in that organization are aware of what needs to be done. This is why we're talking about developing effective domestic abuse policies. The second step was to train the staff members to recognize the signs of domestic abuse and reduce the risks related to domestic abuse. So in order to do that, we created a program of 3 different modules where we were talking about domestic abuse in the first module. Then the second one, we decided to speak about harmful practices. And the third one was more related with the role of men and gaslighting and the local strategy for them to understand what was going on locally in Hillingdon. Now I can tell you that we have improved and we have developed a new module, and we have decided to tackle or work towards tackling sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And this fourth module that we have recently developed is regarding the nighttime economy, because we really want to make sure that Healingdon becomes a safe space for women. And finally, after following these different trainings and consultancy sessions, we wanted to guide employers in establishing a physical space or physical spaces in the workplace for the disclosure of domestic abuse. And of course, given the fact that we were in different restrictions, we were also thinking about how important it is to develop these, if not only physical spaces, but also online spaces where victims of domestic abuse could disclose and feel safe. As I said, we had this consultancy phase that was related with the domestic abuse policies, how to create these safe spaces. We provided different packs and toolkits for the people to understand what domestic abuse is, what is a safety space, and how to handle these domestic abuse disclosures. The program was really successful. We had around 200 participants in the program, which represented around 40 organizations that could range from statutory agencies, we had schools, we had the local libraries, we had businesses, and we also had charities. And we really discovered through this program that it is absolutely important that all people are into it, that people learn to recognize the signs, and that people are not feeling afraid or ashamed to ask what's going on, and to refer the people to the right places. I'm going to stop sharing at the moment, but I just wanted to tell you that it was really, really important for us, and something that I discovered during this program is that it was not only about the people becoming champions, you know, because initially we could expect, yes, all these people are going to learn about it, they are going to be able to support women and people experiencing domestic abuse. But the reality is that even the people who came to the training just thinking, I am going to help these people because this is something that I want to do, they suddenly discover themselves as victims of domestic abuse. So this really tells you how important it is that we have these preventative measures, because even though we think that we know what domestic abuse is, we cannot make assumptions. The reality is that the majority of people don't know it. They don't recognize it. They have normalized it. They are ashamed to really talk about it. So I really think that the big lesson is that education is paramount, honesty, and stop the fear of not talking about it, because this is a taboo and people don't want to talk about it. It is a problem and needs to be tackled. And we need to confront it and we need to talk about it, because there's no other way we're going to find a solution if we don't just keep that hidden at home where people think it happens, because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And you know the statistics, you know, I don't know how many women we have in this panel and in this workshop, but given the statistics, probably some of us have already experienced domestic abuse or are experiencing at the moment. So no one can escape from this. So this is why we really need to take this very importantly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vicky. And I think you're quite right. Everyone probably knows somebody who has been affected or are affected by such a significant issue. And we know that from statistically, only 5% of businesses in the UK hold a domestic abuse policy. And you very clearly highlighted why it's so important to have that policy in the first place. We also know that the domestic abuse strategy will call for businesses to do more when it comes to the workplace and domestic abuse. So my question to you is, what more can organisations and businesses, or even employees who are probably listening in, what can we all do to ensure that initiatives such as Workspace Safe Place is rolled out across all businesses to ensure that the employers take that safeguarding duty towards their employees?
Well, I guess that we have different ways to do it, but definitely it's about talk about it. And if you find out that there is an initiative like Workplace Safe Space around your area, or just try to communicate it to the people working along with you, because sometimes we feel like, well, yeah, maybe I can do it. No, maybe they're not interested. But if we keep on pushing, if we actually push to get that, we will get it. And I'm telling you this because we had some fantastic organizations, and the employees themselves, they were eager to learn, they were eager to do something, and they were literally challenging their bosses because they wanted to do more. So it's actually that speaking out and saying that things need to be done, and that's the only way. So I really encourage you to find out wherever you work. I don't know where you're working. Try to find out if you have a domestic abuse policy, because believe me, lots of businesses and organizations don't have it. And I'm going to tell you that even in the charity world, where we are like, oh yes, I'm going to support this woman, I know how I'm going to help her, and we are giving everything to support the women outside, we just don't look at what's going on internally. And maybe we don't even have a domestic abuse policy, even if we are a women's organization. So we really need to question and try to find out and start making changes.
Vicky, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And thanks for keeping to time as well. And I'm sure that we're going to have some more really lively conversations around the work that you're doing and potentially what other people are doing. So if anyone on this call has got similar initiatives, please do put that in the chat and direct any questions to Vicky as well. So last but certainly not least, I'm delighted to welcome Detective Sergeant Viren Wiltshire, who has worked at the Met Police for 21 years. She's currently based within the Continuous Policing Improvement Command and is accountable for the development, implementation and monitoring of policies. And as a domestic abuse subject matter expert, Viren has a proven track record of improving outcomes for victims and their families. So Viren, firstly, welcome and thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I'd love to go straight into your presentation, if that's okay.
Yeah, let me start sharing your presentation. So hopefully you can all see that now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So I work on the central policy team, and our oversight is around the strategic response to domestic abuse in the Met Police. So my small team, we work across the whole of London, the whole of the MPS as such, and we look at best practice, policies, working with the College of Policing, working with partners. And, you know, our aims are, we do want to reduce the harm, and we want to reduce the harm per head population and per victim. We work at looking at repeat victimisation and working with our CPS partners to looking at how we can be more effective by working in partnership and improving that with courts and our witness care team. So not just not just the police, but a whole sort of systems approach in that. Over 9.3 million London residents, and as you can see, the number of police officers, the figure may be slightly less than that. So if I go on to the next slide, this is the rolling 12 months. So we looked at the rolling 12 months. This is ending up to the end of August. The Met received over 151,000 domestic incident reports, and the figure varies across the capital. So I've broken that down slightly further because I know we are now borough command units broken down in 12, but we still have our local authorities within those that we work with. So I've broken it down to our local authorities. And you can see how it varies from West area to Central North. We need to ensure that there's a right number of officers in those places in order to, work with the demand across those local authorities within those units. Not everything ends up being what we call a home office threshold to meet as a recorded crime. So out of the 151,000, only 94,000 of those met the threshold of that. I don't want to focus too much on data because data changes very quickly and everything. We're still at the moment working to the cross-government definition of domestic abuse, and we're working with the Home Office as and when those changes come and are implemented on the change in the definition and all the other changes the Act has brought in. And we're working on all those and implementing those as they're placed. We've recently just updated the domestic abuse policy within the police to include some of the changes that have been brought in. We're currently on the Home Office working group around the controlling and coercive behaviour to ensure that officers do understand the difference between, CCB and stalking and harassment. And in order to understand domestic abuse as well, I totally advocate, about having an employee response to it as well. In 2019, I wrote our domestic abuse employee policy because we understand our organisation is huge, and within that we do have victims and perpetrators. So we tested that around what the hurdles will be. I did a survey to understand what the issues were, what the challenges were. So the policy was implemented, but not just the policy. We also brought in an employee IDVA to support officers and staff. Because by understanding what's happening internally and getting our house in order, I hope that we can give a better response to our members of the public by understanding that domestic abuse. Like mentioned earlier by Emily, we have just completed our rollout of domestic abuse matters training to over, I think it was just under 7,000 officers in the end, that frontline officers who all receive that training, and we're hoping to secure further funding so that we can continue that programme and continue the traction, because we don't want to see it as just a one-off training day. It has to be a cultural change, a cultural shift around that. So as mentioned, there has been a change to the statutory definitions, and where it mentions around children, we need to ensure that our systems are in place and our response is in place, and we have support for those children as well. So we work with our partners and our colleagues who work in different little command areas. So like I said, my team's on the domestic abuse team, and we will have a response for the child abuse team. And we need to make sure that when we're working, we work together on understanding the implications when we start recording children as victims, and ensure that they do get the support that is needed for them. So there was mention of DAPOs. This will replace domestic violence protection orders eventually. DAPOs are a little way off at the moment, so we still are working with domestic violence protection orders. We're doing a lot of work around raising awareness for that internally, because often it's deemed that it might be a lengthy process, a long process. Officers don't get to court. We haven't used our technology around that. We've been working with courts so that it can now be done online and virtually. So then, victims and survivors don't have to go to court in order to do that. It's streamlined the process completely and taken that step out that often might have been seen as a challenge or a hurdle. And the same with Clare's Law. We've implemented technology and used what's available, ensuring that, the support is put in place. But even with Clare's Law, Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, we can use online platforms in order to give that disclosure, rather than, a victim or survivor having to attend, a police station or a building in order to do that. Providing it's a safe method, and we've worked through all the risks around that, it can be done in a much more modern method. So we understand around the underreporting, and I know it says hard to reach, but perhaps it's not as hard to reach. Perhaps it's us not being able to reach them and how we reach out. We run a Victims Voice Forum, which is a platform made up of partner agencies. There's a significant number of partners that attend that, and it is made up of, across London. So we have Sign Health, Vision Foundation, You know, they attend, you know, we have representatives from the Black and Asian community, Gallup attend that meeting, Susie Lampu. So it really does give us a real understanding. And it is called the Victims' Voice Forum. It was initially represented by agencies who represent that victim and survivor. And we have in the last few months introduced survivor voices into that platform. And it's a platform for our partners to challenge us and also to sense check material for us. So if we are going to do some wider messaging with our media teams, and we're about to do some communications, whether that's, you know, posters or whether it's video campaigns, we sense check it with our partners to ensure our messaging is right, because not everyone understands the term domestic abuse, and therefore we need to understand that our approach is appropriate and it's going to reach, you know, all parts of and all communities. So again, I totally agree, we need to play DA on an equal footing with other crimes. You know, very much that, you know, the hidden crime, we need to make it about a talked about conversation. The organisation has now come a long way in recognising mental health, and it's talked about, and we have blue light champions, and everyone's much more open to talking about it, and we need to get domestic abuse on that same platform. So victim attrition, we understand, you know, the first call we get and that first contact is so important as well. Domestic abuse matters training to frontline officers has massively assisted the officers in understanding the nuances upon arrival of an incident, and perhaps why the victim might not be engaging at that point, and for them to be more professionally curious at those incidents and probe more to draw out, you know, perhaps any controlling measures, you know, ensuring that there is, you know, safety around the victims too. It's not just about getting a CJS outcome. We understand not everybody wants that. Equally, for us, we need to ensure that the victim is safeguarding. So proactivity around domestic abuse. We had predatory offender units set up who look at our high harm offenders. And by high harm, we use the recency, frequency and gravity matrix, now merged with the harm matrix. So we look at our most harmful offenders, and our predatory offender units proactively work around those. We call them dauntless in our organisation, and if a dauntless offender, then we do actively work with them. We have the drive programme as well in the Met, that's across, you know, Croydon. They have drive in there. It's recently rolled out wider, and we look at lots of technology, GPS tagging, a probation-led initiative supported by the police, where those being released from prison, DA perpetrators, are tagged upon release, and that comes with certain conditions, and it offers victims that reassurance because we can track and give areas that the person can't, that the offender cannot go within, and therefore it gives much more reassurance. And you know, again, those initiatives are brought into the Victims' Voice Forum to allow those conversations to take place about maybe something that's not being thought about that can be applied. And it was, you know, it was positively, you know, endorsed that this would be a great initiative to continue. Every incident officers attend with their body-worn video if it's a domestic abuse incident, or whether that's a crime or non-crime, all domestic incidents when upon the officer should be recorded on body-worn video. And we scope more things. We've recently scoped audio alarms, audio panic alarms as an installation, so it captures audio as well. And obviously we understand Marek. Marek in London obviously is massive and huge, and you could see the volume across different areas from West area to Central North, and therefore we don't want to start putting caps on the cases going, nor do we want to become a triage system. So we work with our partners to understand the systems around that and make sure that cases are getting there. And it's not just about, you know, how many, you know, scores on a book or anything, but, you know, cases that need to go to Marek are ending up there. I work closely with our specialist crime review group on domestic homicide reviews, and there was a whole piece of work around that during COVID. Our team were involved with that, looking at domestic homicides in a DA setting, and you know, where there was recommendations or learning that can be drawn from that, they were implemented, and we continue to learn from those. So I just wanted to mention about, we talked about no further action earlier. So I just want to make sure we understand that correctly. No further action is never done on an incident. So each case will get recorded, whether it's a non-crime book domestic, which is a case that doesn't quite meet the, where the circumstances don't amount to a notifiable crime. They're still recorded and they're still searchable. We don't NFA at the scene. No further action often comes later down the line, where perhaps, we've not been able to engage with the victim, or, there's issues around evidence, and we all do. We've done a lot of work around evidence-led as well with the CPS prosecutors, and delivering training to staff to understand what evidence-led cases mean. So I just wanted to make sure we got that right about NFAing and non-crime but domestics, that we wouldn't ever NFA at a scene in London. In the Met don't do that. So I probably whistled through that really fast, Polly, because I talk very fast.
No, that's absolutely perfect. It gives us a bit more time for some questions, Viren. And you can imagine how popular you are on the chat right now with regards to questions towards the Met Police. We do appreciate you're not here
it's
to
a challenging
answer.
time for us, so I'm more than I will try and answer as I can.
Fantastic, and we're mindful that you can't comment on any ongoing investigations, and that your role isn't exclusively the totality of the police. But there have been some really interesting questions on there, and I just wanted to draw on one of those questions with regards to thresholds, and whether that needs to be adjusted in order to build that confidence for victims to come forward to ensure that their cases are being heard. And another comment that was made on a previous slide, a previous speaker, was around the need for, I think it was Emily, the need for victims to have that space before they actually come forward and make those reports. And sometimes that statutory timeline can be so significant in coming forward, getting yourself safe before you make an informed decision whether you want to go forward with the police. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on what more the police can do to ensure that they build the support and the trust of victims and survivors. We know that this is a crime that is underreported, I mean significantly underreported, yet we also know that the police receive a call around domestic abuse every 30 seconds. So the prevalence is very much there, but it's still very much a hidden harm. So what more can the police do? What more can the Met do to build the trust, to encourage victims and survivors to come forward?
It's really difficult, isn't it? We do work with our partners. We do listen to, what the challenges are, what the issues are, victims not being heard. And, as an organisation, it is hard. We have to remember that we do have now a difference in officers and where they sat with the experience around officers too. So that's what we're working towards, to ensuring that those public protection teams do have the understanding around that, which is where we want to secure further funding around DA Matter, so our secondary investigators get that DA Matter training, but not just them, right from the call handler all the way through to that secondary investigator, because we must not dismiss the call handler plays a significant part in that first contact too, as well. So around thresholds, how can we get our we're trying to make it more open. So, where, you don't have to come into a police station. We launched the online portal back in June. You can report domestic abuse online. It's still a safe method. It's been risk assessed by our partners. It's gone through the process. So you can report domestic abuse either yourself or a third party can online. And it's almost losing the 101 system. But it'd be like a, you can type in as to, your concerns. So we are trying to make, how you can report much more inclusive as well, which we weren't able to do before. It was always either a call to police. Clare's Law, members of the public have a right to ask. If you think that a partner poses or an ex-partner poses a risk, or you're concerned about someone, you have a right to ask, and we will look at those. And it's not anyone who's perhaps committed domestic abuse offences. Our officers now have the understanding that it can be violent offences that can be disclosed. So it's not having this perpetrator, it doesn't have to have a history of DA, it's perhaps a history of violence. And we can make the, the partners aware of that information, and so they can make informed choices as well. Signposting, you know, we're going to launch a support agencies app as well, because it's really difficult, isn't it, at a scene or at an incident where you're giving a tear off bit of paper to somebody. Where do they keep that paper? So we're looking at safe contact methods, and we're launching the support agencies app, which means we can send it directly to you to a safe contact place, and you have that list of agencies, so when you're ready you can seek support and you can contact us, you know. So we are exploring all these available options as well.
Can I just go back on what you mentioned about the right to ask? Could you just explain a little bit about the difference between the right to ask and the right to know, and what that process might entail for anyone who might be interested here?
Yeah, so right to ask you can do online. So you can submit a Clare's Law application online. I will call it Clare's Law because I know the proper term is Domestic Violence Disclosure, you know, scheme. However, it was sort of from Clarewood, you know, around that. So for this purpose, I'll call it Clare's Law. So don't be offended if I'm referring to a female Clare. It is open to everybody across all genders. So the public can ask the police about a partner or ex-partner, or if they're concerned that a partner of someone they know may pose a risk. And you can submit that application online. It goes directly to a safeguarding team who assess that within a certain time period. They will do their research on that, and they will look, not just look within the Met, they will look across other forces to see if there's any information on that person that they've disclosed about. And then we will then, the right to know is when it's assessed, and we take it to a detective inspector to sign off to say we think this person needs to be made aware of this information. And we work with partner agencies as well to ensure that you know, there is support around that. And it can be taken to MARAC as well to discuss in that MARAC platform if needed, in case partner agencies hold key information.
Oh, that's fantastic. Viren, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And like I said, there's a huge amount of conversation in the chat, which I couldn't possibly fit into this short session for now, but please do take a look. Certainly, there's a huge amount of respect for you to coming on in this climate to talk about the issues, and it's quite clear your passion comes through on this area of work. So just to, before I hand over to Vic for the panel discussion, I do want to say a huge thank you to all our speakers. It's quite clear from each of those presentations that everyone is playing their part to end domestic abuse. I would now like to hand over to Vic, Dr. Victor Elisa, QPM, who will lead on the panel discussion with all our amazing speakers. And again, please do continue to post your questions, comments and observations in the chat. So over to you, Vic.
Thank you, Polly. Just want to echo Polly's word to all our speakers presented this afternoon. Been an exceptional presentation by each and every one of you, and it's been really educating and invigorating to see that we cover from the concept of police discretion, where Viren talks about policy and what the organisation wants to do, and we see sadly that those policy doesn't always translate to practice on the ground because of police discretion. And it's good to hear about the Domestic Violence Commissioner and her wonderful role, regulatory and holding police forces to account. And again, you know, as a police officer, one of the concepts that we often talk about that actually drives us around the twist is having 43 different chiefs who want to do their own thing. So trying to get a consistency across policing in England and Wales is always challenging. And you know, and to Vicky and the work that you're doing in terms of partnership, and as I said before, the word that was seen from Vikram. So echoing one Polly's statement is that everybody's involved in actually preventing, which I think we can all achieve, and removing domestic abuse and violence to women. But I want to ask all our panelists to start with the questions, and hopefully we can get through some of these. But if we don't, then I'm sure Polly will find a way of responding to the questions through a written form at a later date. But for all our panelists, I want to ask you this question, and it's twofold. So what can we do now? What can we do now to reduce the risk of violence, and also to reduce the risk of the severity of violence to women and girls. Yeah, because I say that there is a risk of violence to women and girls, but we also find that the severity, sadly, from what we hear and read at the moment, is getting worse. So who would like to go first, please? Well, so Emily, you look as though you're eager to go. So Emily, will you please?
I was getting confused between my hand and the mute button, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I'll start with two very obvious things, and I think it's everybody's priority, but it's how we actually put them into action. One is around prevention, which has been mentioned, particularly with the younger generation. As part, I'm 2 days a week for the Commissioner's office, but 3 days a week I'm at the London Borough of Sutton, where I'm the commissioning manager for the local authority and the domestic abuse lead. And as part of the contract that we commission as an integrated service, we do a lot of prevention work through our pupil referral unit across the borough. And I spent the morning this morning observing some sessions with young men called Becoming a Man. It's a course that they do, and it's fascinating to see the insight into belief systems from such an early age, you know, thoughts around sexual harassment, misogyny, and I think there is a huge need to be getting messages into schools and with young people in terms of prevention. It doesn't deal with the problem we've got out there right now in society in terms of people doing these things, but if we're ever going to make a change, we have to have a focus and additional resource on prevention, and tackling perpetrators. So again, you know, I think Drive was mentioned. There's loads of other sort of behaviour change programmes. The police are obviously the key player in the CPS in terms of tackling perpetrators, whereas a lot of other agencies deal with the symptoms of domestic abuse, you know, the victims, the children, the crisis, the health effects. You know, we need the police to really be holding perpetrators to account and not tolerating behaviours, and that has to be modelled from within the culture, as well as the responses that you give to the general public as well. And I know, you know, that comes down to a lot of trust and things that we've talked about already, but I think that's absolutely essential. So I know locally and our partnership board, but also at the Commissioner's office, two of the key things we're focusing on is prevention and perpetrators.
Emily, that's really useful, but just let me just push you just a little bit further when you talk about the culture in policing, actually encouraging the police to actually pursue the perpetrators. My word, not yours. How can the Commissioner's office make that happen more often than it is at the moment? Because I get from your answer that you probably don't think, or the Commissioner's office don't think, is happening as much as it ought to. Again, no, I don't want you to commit you to do something, but how can we do that?
No, I mean, I think they are, and I think some of it is very dependent on where you are, and this is part of the role of the Commissioner, is about, you know, bringing consistency and losing that postcode lottery of responses, and you know, the Met are doing an awful lot around this in terms of consistency, and the DA Matters training is really helping that, and lots of other processes and policies that are being put in place. I've lost what you actually asked me in the question, sorry.
No, there was a hint there in the sense of, you know, you felt that the police could do more in the culture of actually dealing with perpetrators, and I was just wondering what the Commissioner's office can do to actually encourage that activity rather than processes and policies.
Yeah, so I think some of that comes back to the work in terms of holding government and public bodies to account. So we can make recommendations and requests for data. For example, the Commissioner will be able to do that from the 1st of November when her powers come into play. We also, you know, do a lot of responses to strategies that are put out by the government. So they're currently writing a domestic abuse specific strategy. You know, the VAUG one has come out, but the domestic abuse specific one hasn't, and we'll be scrutinising that and looking at that as a whole, and making comments and recommendations for that. So there's a number of things that we're able to do at a national level in terms of influencing government and policy in their response to this. And obviously police sit within the Home Office, and that's one of our key partners who we hold to account. So there, you know, there are powers there that we can use if needed to do that going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And one of the things that I will be looking forward to is the consistency, although a lot of the conversation will be around the Met at the moment, but there are, issues that need to be addressed across the country.
Absolutely.
So if I can, sorry, go on, Emily.
No, I was just going to say in my role at the Commissioner's Office, I cover London and the South East, so I do speak to other forces and PCCs around the country as well. So yeah, it is absolutely postcode lottery depending on where you are across England and Wales.
Fabulous, thank you. What I'm going to do is just take the order for our panelists, so you can have a chance to prepare. Vicky, if I'd ask you to go next, then Daisy, then Viran, because I think Viran, hopefully you'll be able to go into some of the details of what the Met are doing that we're probably not aware of, and I've no doubt that the organisation is doing quite a lot. So Vicky, can I ask you to go next for that question, which is what can we do now to reduce the risk of violence and the severity of violence to women and girls?
Well, I guess that it's like a very, very difficult question, because I was thinking the same thing as Emily, and it's all about prevention, but it's really going to take a while for things to change. But personally, I believe that police would really need to enforce the law when it comes to women, and I'm speaking from the perspective of the women. When women report domestic abuse, we are still having some issues in terms of not being believed or no further action, and things become twisted or they are taken lightly. So basically, doing their job would be the best. And I don't think that we can blame all police officers, but in reality, there are many cases where there comes this situation where women no longer trust the police because they are not believed. So in a sense, it's a matter of changing mindset, which comes with prevention, and it takes a while, I guess. So this is what's making it more difficult. But I guess that I'm also thinking about how different agencies or charities supporting domestic abuse survivors are having these financial issues, that maybe there need to be changes in the way that we are being funded, because suddenly I can see that we had the restriction, we had the lockdown, domestic abuse is a big issue. Wow, 25 million pounds, or I don't know how many millions they decided to invest. But suddenly many services really responded, got these funds and continue delivering the service. But now these funds are gone. Those funds were just for a limited period of time. The demand is still there. It is increasing, but we no longer have the funds. So it is not sustainable for many charities to continue providing that basic immediate support when the crisis is happening to keep women safe, if this is not actually planned. So yes, probably for me it would be the resources that we need, because the government by themselves, they are not going to be able to tackle it. It's an effort from all the different parties. And I know that now it's very difficult because of the different financial situations that we are living, but suddenly we are left alone with no more funds to continue or the programs. And it's not only our organization. I've heard from so many other women's organizations that they are just like trying to keep alive these projects that were born during the lockdown, and that they are still needed. It was not something like it exploded, happened during the lockdown, there is a vaccine, suddenly domestic abuse is going to disappear. It's there and it's going to stay for a long time.
No, absolutely, Vicky. And the point of funding is one that's very well made, particularly to the type of programs that you're running, where you build trust with, women who are potential victims of domestic abuse, actual victims of domestic abuse, the victims of serious violence and domestic abuse. Having that trust that they can come to your programs and other programs is absolutely essential to getting to that stage of moving on to enforcement and reassurance. But that point is very well made. Thank you. Daisy?
Hi, Victor. Well, I think Emily and Vicky have covered a lot about all the things that, that we need to do. From an academic perspective, I think the one thing that we need to tackle is police gender biases. That is something that is there and that we need to do something about it. In order for other police officers to see, domestic abuse as a priority and a serious crime. And I feel like it is impossible to change mindsets if we don't call things by their name. Let me give you an example. If we look into the police education qualification framework, the one is in place at the moment, the PQF, and there you can see that the information there is going to be for police officers to train them. However, while this education qualification framework talk about police quota, they don't talk about masculinity quota. And given the historical masculine context, the history of the police, I believe that is something very important that we have to discuss in there. So we have to acknowledge and name things by their name. So, and if we talk about, for example, that we are going to name masculinity quota, from a migrant women perspective, I think that then we have to talk about racism, because then we have to consider then the experiences of migrant women in there. What happened when a migrant woman then requests help? What happened when a migrant woman is the one asking for support? And what are the dynamics in there? Okay, as a migrant woman myself, I can say that, there's kind of like a two-tier system there. Sometimes when a victim calls the police, the first thing to ask is, their immigration status. So which put, migrant women in a very difficult position. So, we need to start calling things by their name, and we need to dig into these, deep rooting problems that are there. So it is just important to acknowledge that. In relation to funding, yes, definitely. We need to start providing more funding to the police, because if we think about it, 66 million we spend a year in domestic abuse. However, only 1.3 million are actually directed to the police for investigation. When you compare that with terrorism, we spend 1.2 million. So when we actually evaluate the harm then, so every year we have, between the last 10 years, there has been probably around 2,000 victims of domestic abuse, 2,000 homicides, sorry. And then only 126 homicides for terrorism. So where are we placing the priorities then? So we need to actually then investigate crime in relation to the priorities. I am not saying with this that we should not investigate terrorism anymore, but then we should actually then see what is causing more harm directly now to, to citizens, and let's try to do something about it. So, sometimes it becomes easier to say the police need to do more. Yes, but they need to be found for that. They need to be found for that. We need more police officers. We need more training. We need more of that. And yeah, including in that training, we have then to try to, tackle, gender biases within the police institution then.
Thank you, Daisy. Valuable points there. Vera, you've listed some of the things that you're doing at the moment, the Mets are doing. If I just bring in two angles to what has been said by Daisy and Vicky. One is, in your interaction with across London, do you have a conversation that actually calls it what it is, domestic abuse, and get to that empathetic level with officers, rather than the discretion and sense of this is going to be difficult, we're not going to get very far with dealing with this, so let's just do the best that we can, keep it short and move on? So do you call it what it is when you're actually having that interaction with officers, training in your policy making? And how closely do you work with partners to help with actually reducing the risk of violence and the severity of violence?
So our team was only formed in 2019. Okay, so if you think how many years has the Met been and how long domestic abuse has been around, and our little team are one and three. That's a detective inspector, a DS, and 3 DC, 3 detective constables, cover the whole of London, and we do work with lots of partners, right from learning and development to recruits, to those that are coming out of training, to the seasoned detectives, the supervisors to ensure that there's no pressure put on staff around getting to the next call or getting that case done quickly. And we, and we do address those that victim blaming language. So I know it was talked about, those challenging, not being a bystander. We actively challenge those conversations, not just with ourselves as well, but with the CPS, too. So if we're going to be sending a letter out to, a victim survivor, perhaps their case isn't being pursued, we don't use the term because you didn't engage with us, because that's automatically victim blaming. This case wasn't proceeded with these reasons. Not saying because you didn't want to come to court, because that's not the only reason. There's often other matters. So we are addressing it, and like I said, it does start at that recruit school to get them to here. And we have survivors who now talk to recruits leaving when they first end training, and they're passing out parade. So survivors speak. And in order to get the officers more engaged, like I said, that internal focus, so senior officers who disclose, perhaps their, domestic abuse story, to understand that actually, if a senior officer can be a victim of domestic abuse, it can happen to anyone. So that's how we're making it more talked about. It's really hard in the Met. We are all broken up into various commands, so I do try to focus on those masculine commands that are perhaps the ones that you'll perceive as the masculine ones, our firearms command, our territorial support groups. We reach out to them, which is why our employee IDFA doesn't just take female clients. She will, manage male clients, and we've given the understanding to her as well. And we've broken down a myth. She joins our Victims' Voice Forum to understand the cultural barriers and that intersectionality as well, because it's not just about perhaps, being Indian. It could be I could be Indian and I might be gay, and therefore the hurdles that might bring by outing someone or outing anybody as well. And understand those myths. So our partners actually played an active part in our domestic abuse policy, and I reached out to partners who said, give me the myths, give me the understanding. What should officers be thinking about when they attend an incident where there might be somebody who's deaf, Asian and gay? How do we manage that? How do officers understand that? And they provided me with all that guidance that is now included in our policy. It forms part of that policy.
Thanks, Viram. I'm going to go for another big question, and then we can pick up some of the smaller ones, because very rarely do we have the opportunity to have these types of discussions. So I'm going to ask, what do the police across the country? Yeah, so I don't want to be focused in the Met, but what do the police across the country, the England and Wales, need to do to prepare for the next 12 months? We are where we are today, but there is a real challenges in the next 12 months. One of which is how do we, I'm going to use the word, rebuild trust in the institution of policing by women and girls who are victims of violence.
For me, I wish we would almost go back to basics. So we have some wonderful technology, lots of amazing ideas, but sometimes it is just about going back to basics. It is about walking around. It is about linking with those communities. We need to make sure that the experience is managed across all places. I know, the Commissioner's talked about the town centre teams coming in to have a more visible presence, but what we don't want is those town centre teams made up of just new officers, so that there is that experience there. So for me, it'd be that, and looking at, when we do get cases, to ensure there aren't that, the conversation between a uniform officer and what we would call a detective takes place. That they're more visible, that they're able to speak to each other. It has made it more difficult with borough command units. You might have your uniform presence at another station, and your detective teams your public protection teams might sit in another station. It's making sure that they are visibly engaged with each other, because a handover on a phone isn't going to have the same impact as a handover face to face. Removing the need from getting a paper copy across somewhere. So using our electronic methods to get those cases across, so encouraging officers to use their tablets more, so that we're not waiting, say from one bit, I want a book to go from one borough to another. And, we try to encourage officers to understand in their statements too, looking at, what they can put in. So there is what we call an afraid mnemonic, and it's looking about when you arrive, victim's demeanour, and it focuses the officer on how to do their statement. because often we might write victim doesn't want to know anymore, and that's it, and you're going, but why doesn't the victim want to know? So they're not saying it didn't happen, they're saying it did happen, but they've chosen to stop this process for these reasons and getting that recorded. But yeah, we use a mnemonic called AFRAID, and it looks up demeanor, their approach, and then by recording it, it gives a much more visible written document as to how that person was behaving as well. So we make that importance of their accountability as well as just the victim's initial account too, and not focus too much on this I must get a statement here and now for the response officer, because otherwise the CID are going to say, well, I can't take that case because you've not got a statement. It's getting the initial account, getting that safety in place, and then even considering because often we speak to our CPS, and controlling coercive behaviour is often tagged on to perhaps an assault case. So we need to make sure that it's understood slightly better, and if it is controlling coercive, to ensure the officers use perhaps using video evidence to record the victim's account, and making sure those courses are available to them. So it's much more that's what I'd like to see over the next 12 months, that engagement, that conversation, and officers being allowed to take the time at those cases.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. As you're talking now, I was hearing lots of processes, but deep down, I was sensing that empathy. If those officers can be given the time to show that empathy, it doesn't become a process, it becomes a lived experience that will actually just enable the victim to feel a lot more comfortable. And I will throw that to our audience who are listening and learning a great deal from this. If you want to put any comments in the chat, in the next 12 months, if we can get our police officers who are doing the combination of enforcing and providing the service, would empathy be one of the big things that will actually change the landscape in the coming 12 months? Emily, can I come to you next, and I will go to Vicky, and then I will finish with Daisy for this particular question. What do you need to do for the next 12 months?
Yeah, sure. I'll come back to one of my earlier points, and that's about really tapping in at all levels of the Met into the local services that are the local specialist services, the local buy and for services. So obviously at an operational frontline level, that the initial police responders are aware of local signposting information, but also at a more strategic level, making sure that the police are a key strategic partner in every area and really bought into the kind of local response to domestic abuse, aware of what is available to the victims that they're supporting, and also the intersectional needs of the victim, like Viren was talking about, and making the most of those specialist providers that are there, and kind of local authorities and safeguarding responsibilities within them as well. And I think in terms of building trust, now is the time to be doing that the most, because they're your key people that are going to support the victims and take pressure off the police by doing so. And so keeping them in the loop with what you're doing and vice versa is going to be absolutely essential over the next 12 months. So for any area, I would be suggesting that you reach out to local partnership boards, you reach out to local authorities and local providers. And I know the Met have a lot to do with victim support, and there's a lot of great work going on there, and they have a lot of specialist provision within victim support, but that's not always the main commission provider in every area. There's other local services that go on, and a lot of it, and I have this from my own experience within my local area as well, and areas I talk to, is all of that joining up work between agencies, and that shared vision and those shared objectives and priorities. So that would be a kind of key priority that I would be proposing for the next 12 months.
Excellent. And it's a nice segue to you, Vicky, in terms of the fabulous work that you're providing.
Yes, I think that the multi-agency work is really, really important, that we all have the opportunity to establish these communication systems or these links to make sure that we are actually holding the most information when we are dealing with survivors. But I am also thinking about the possibility of having a trauma-informed perspective and practice, because it really is a game changer. Even I can confess that me working in the sector for 7 years, initially I had no idea about this trauma-informed perspective, and as a practitioner, you suddenly have run into conclusions about specific behaviors, why this is happening. Maybe you get detached from specific cases, you get angry, you feel there is no consistency. But once that you include this trauma perspective, that you really understand what is going on, even beyond the fact that we may know the definitions of domestic abuse, I can know the early warning signs, the red flags, the legal side. I may know that all that academic part of domestic abuse, but if I don't know the trauma perspective, my reaction and my approach to these cases is going to be very different, and I may not be grasping all the information that I need, and I'm not going to be a good service provider in this case. So for me, it's a trauma perspective. Absolutely, that's something that needs to change quickly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vicky. And I'd just like to throw a twist in there just for people to think about. It can become so easy to put all the blame on police officers in terms of not doing the right things on the scene. But just that trauma related perspective of how much of that actually has an impact on officers if they go into calls on a regular basis, incidents, and sometimes feel that they probably cannot deal with a particular incident, with a particular crime as best as they can. Does that build in their psyche in the sense of you always feel that it's a losing cause every time they go to a call because there's always something they're going to get drawn to go and deal with? Just a thought. Daisy.
I think taking, from what you just said, Victor, I think one important thing is about understanding the dynamics of domestic abuse. We need to understand the trauma. We need to understand what this person is going through. Each perpetrator designed their own strategy to keep power and control. So when you get these cases when the woman, call the police, but after that she decided not to do it, it's because there is a lot going on in there. There is the fear. There is, the whole controlling things. In these things, we always see, the tip of the iceberg. When the person call and there maybe is physical violence in there, and maybe is the person is in risk of harm. However, there is so much going on. There is so much going on. And this is the part where we actually have to improve training about learning about the whole dynamic. Because, as a domestic abuse survivor myself, I can say that when you actually are exposed to harm for such a long time, it is very difficult to come out. It is very, very difficult even to identify that you are in a position that something can happen to you, that you are in denial. There is so much going on. There is so many dynamics in there, and that is something that we need to understand. And that's something that the police officer need to learn how to approach. If a survivor say, I don't want to press any charges, there are other ways to keep that bridge there open okay, you don't want to press charges right now, but there is information in here, we can do this for you. And it is about the sympathy. And then when you abuse for long term, it's very difficult. It's very common to know that nobody will sympathize with your experience. So, and this is when we're actually talking about the harm and the trauma. So having that friendly harm in there to say, okay, you're not ready right now, but the help is here if you need it. And that's what we need. And that will be the way to reassure the public and that the police is there for them. And perhaps, we need to focus more on the good officers, those that are dedicated to providing an exceptional policing, maybe to hold, to challenge and educate and hold accountable those ones that are not doing it. So maybe we have to turn the table around and try to, which one are the ones that are doing a good work? Okay, this is the ones that we can use them to campaign, to improve the culture, to change all this behavior within the police institution.
No, Daisy, you raise a good point there in the sense of one of the many discussions we've had around the areas of domestic abuse is, should we have officers specially trained who are skilled, experienced, and we send them to deal with domestic abuse? The way we have public order officers, the way we have firearms officers, the way we have, officers who are trained to deal with sexual violence. These are all possibly ideas we can pick up in the conference that we'll be holding on the 30th of November, looking just focusing on domestic abuse, and we're going to have to spend more time to actually have those discussions. So please put that date in your diary, and we can perhaps pick up some of these topics that we're not able to at the moment. I'm just going to ask two questions, one specific and one for you to think about for a sentence. So the next one is, when we talk about domestic violence, there is that presumption that it's a partner-based domestic violence, is marital. But there's a question that's been put on one of our attendees, is saying, what could be done if a child is violent towards his parent? Yeah, sibling-related violence. So I'm going to ask you just a quick response on that. We go around, and then I'm going to ask all of you just to give me one point of how can we build trust. How can we rebuild trust in the policing service provision of domestic abuse for victims? So the first one is, what could be done if the child is violent to his parent?
So if a child is, so we know there's no actual kind of statutory kind of guidance around this. I did signpost, I know of a handful of charities around this, but we do recognise it, so if a child is abusing a parent, you can report it. If you're not comfortable reporting it, I did put PEGS in there. That's, and I apologise, there probably are others out there, but that's the one I know of from, the top of my head. So that is signposted within there. There should be guidance within there for that person on how they can seek help, but you can report it, and obviously we will understand, the best team who can deal with that, because we have our experts who manage children, and we have our experts who manage domestic abuse. There's no reasons why those two teams can't have a conversation as to who's best approached to manage that incident, that case. So yeah, it can be reported. We understand it can be an emerging theme, along with the adult parent, the adult to parent violence too. So we are understanding those things too. We work with Hourglass to understand the abuse around the older community too. So we are working on that, and we're working with Tender as well to understand domestic abuse in the younger, generation too. So yeah. So apologies, there are probably other charities, but the one I knew of was PEGS.
Brilliant, thanks, Vera. I'm going to apologise for not allowing anyone else to answer this, but if I just go through all of you, just one thing that, how can we build trust in the police at the moment? It's just really challenging times. Just one point from all of you. Crikey, it's not that bad. I mean,
no, it's difficult.
It is challenging. It is hard. Look, we equally feel massively let down. All we can do is work on this. Work with our partners, keep understanding, keep those conversations open. We're a small team. We're only London. I should imagine, we want to work with, nationally on this too. We're understanding the purpose in our, organisation. We are starting to address those. With the implementation of the employee IDVA, we're seeking to now get an employee ISVA in the organisation for that. So once we start addressing it, internally and challenging those behaviours, and we need to ensure that people aren't fearful of doing those as well. And we can only break that down slowly. It's not going to happen overnight. We are trying. So, we just got to keep those conversations going and keep it open and keep DA on the agenda,
Yeah, I think for me, it's, we've talked loads about empathy and being trauma informed in terms of responding to domestic abuse. But I think there's also something about empathy with the general public in terms of rebuilding trust. And the strongest messages I've heard in recent weeks are police officers openly saying, we also feel sickened by what's happening, and dropping the defensiveness and having some empathy with the general public, that that the police are also horrified by this, and taking a stand with the public, I think is something that can really be quite powerful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emily.
I was saying there that there may be accountability is something very important, and we have to show the public that every person they actually commit a crime can be held accountable for their actions, including police officers. And that is the best message, accountability. If you are misbehaving, if you are not bounded by the law, everybody, including officers, need to be held accountable.
Yeah, excellent. Vicky?
Yeah, I guess that they have covered all my thoughts. And basically for me is honesty and transparency. I know that it's very difficult to actually say, I am wrong, I was wrong, but we don't listen that. I mean, we really need to address this as a systemic problem. And I totally understand and I celebrate that there are people from police actually saying that they are disgusted with what's happening. But what we would like to hear is the whole system, the big bosses saying that we were wrong. We don't want this to happen again. This is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed, and we are going to work on it, and we need to see it. But as long as there is no, they do not vocalize this, probably people are not going to believe. And no. That is really sorry. It's about transparency and honesty.
No, and absolutely, that's a perfect note to end on. And I'd like to say to all our presenters and the panelists, it's been, I mean, this is an area that's always interesting, but today, this evening, having your direct response, not working around the houses, not talking around the shop, but going directly at what needs to be done, and the passion with which you're given that, I think is absolutely exceptional, and this is where we need to be. And with discussions like this, we can help the police, to be the service provider and the enforcers where they need to be. And just to take a phrase that was said very early on, it's all our responsibility to make sure that women and girls are safe wherever they are, whether behind closed doors or whether in a public place. So a massive thank you for all of you. Massive thank you to Polly and Karen in the background for all the organisation. And I'll hand over now to Bob, who's waiting patiently. He's probably thinking to himself, that Victor Olisa could never keep to time even when he tried. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Victor. Would I ever say that of you? Can I just echo Victor's thoughts, ladies? Polly, first of all, thanks for getting such a stellar cast together for us. Vicky, Daisy, Emily, Viran, fantastic presentations, really thought-provoking. For me, certainly very uncomfortable as well, but, quite rightly so. You have held an audience of 50 or 60 people for 2 hours spellbound. You've only just got to look at the questions that are being asked just to show that. So can I just thank all of you for everything you've done and your continuing work in this really important subject, to which sadly there are no easy answers, and I suspect you're going to be busy for some time. But in terms of our conferences, you've set the bar really, really high, for which I hugely thank you. Our next one is next Tuesday, same time, slightly different subject, talking about the pandemic. But Stuart Hyde and Superintendent Hannah Wheeler from the BTP are really going to have their work cut out following the quality of today. So on behalf of the London Policing College, everybody that's listening today, just thank you, everybody, for everything you've done for us. A fantastic set. So thank you very much, everybody. To all our listeners and our guests, thank you so much for joining in for your questions. As Polly said at the beginning, it has been recorded if you want to go back in. If you have further questions, we'll do our best to get them answered somehow and get them back to you. And hopefully this subject will be picked up again at our conference on the 23rd, but again on that further conference that Victor mentioned on the 30th. So on that note, thanks everybody, and safe journeys wherever you're going from now on. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, Tim.
Well done, Tim. Yeah, thank you from Jamaica.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Jamaica.